Canada added another 22,000 jobs in February as the jobless rate held steady at 5%, and that is near historic lows. But as many Canadians keep an eye on the Bank of Canada rate, could this good news job story turn out to be a bad news story down the road? To talk about this, we're now joined by economist Jim Stanford, who is also the director with the Centre for Future Work. Jim, good to see you. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Michael. Thank you.
Listen, let's stick with the good news first and foremost, or I guess you tell me if it's good news, because in addition to more jobs being created, the report points to wage growth that is closing the gap with the rate of inflation. That has to be a positive note for people who've been struggling to make ends meet.
Well, this report is certainly good news for the 22,000 Canadians who found work in the last month, in February. So that's a positive. That means they've got a chance to support themselves. It also is good news in the sense it shows the interest rate increases that we've been grappling with over the last year have not yet, anyways, knocked the stuffing out of our labor market. So that's positive. We've still got some gradual positive job creation. And then the wage numbers, as you point out, the average wages have grown a little over 5% year over year in the last 12 months. That's still not keeping up with inflation, but it is narrowing the gap. And I think sometime in the next few months, we will see a situation where wages once again are growing faster than prices, which is how it should be.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about the impact of this job report going down the road, because in normal times it would be a positive indicator. But in a year when the Bank of Canada has been hiking rates, will this job number added with the unexpected 150,000 jobs back in January, will those numbers actually lead the Bank of Canada to hike its rate again in April?
Yeah, that's the risk. I mean, we do kind of live in an upside-down world, don't we, when good news from the jobs front is seen as bad news in monetary policy or on the financial markets. I think that the bank is going to watch and see what happens. They have a theory about inflation, and their theory is that the inflation is being caused by a labor market that's overheated and wages that are too high. Now, I don't think that theory quite fits the bill. I think we're still dealing with some unique pandemic effects that have affected our price increases. And it is the inflation rate, not employment, that the Bank of Canada targets. So it could be, if inflation comes down in the next few months, as most people expect, they will hold off on further rate increases, even though the employment situation is stronger than they expected and stronger, apparently, than they want. But ultimately, I think it will be the inflation number, not the jobs number, that determines whether we get more interest rate hikes this spring or not.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I don't have to tell this to you, but for people at home, of course, the inflation target for the Bank of Canada is around 2 to 3%. But if inflation is the result of what you suggest here, global pressures, and you're not alone in saying this, and really unique ones at that when you consider Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the effects of the pandemic, are there any other tools the Bank of Canada could be using to address inflation right now as opposed to bringing interest rates back up?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, Michael, and I kind of wish we had asked it more seriously a year ago. We kind of, when inflation first started taking off, all the people went to their old textbooks that they studied economics in after the wage price spiral of the 1970s and said, oh, I know what to do when inflation takes off, increase interest rates and increase unemployment and take the steam out of the labor market. But what if that wasn't the source of this inflation in the first place, as seems to have been the case? So I think ultimately the bank needs to be more balanced and in a way gradual than they have been. They have a new agreement with the federal government, after all, that says they're supposed to pay attention to two things, not just inflation. They're supposed to be promoting maximum sustainable employment. That's part of the bank's marching orders, and I don't think they've paid enough attention to that. I do also think there's a range of other policies that we could use to kind of cool off prices. That could include price caps in certain strategic industries like energy. It could include investments in supply chain to address some of those supply pinch points that cause the higher interest rates. And then count on government, not the Bank of Canada. Bank of Canada isn't the only player here. Count on government to help protect Canadians against the inflation while it lasts, hoping that these after effects of the pandemic eventually work themselves out.
Mm-hmm. Fiscal policy, not just monetary policy.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, the finance minister has announced that the federal budget will be tabled on March the 28th. What would you hope she does to address interest rates and really the struggle it's created for Canadians?
Well, first of all, I hope that she doesn't kind of follow some other old knee-jerk advice, which is that the government should cut back on its spending at this moment. Again, if you don't accept that the problem of inflation right now is because Canadians have too much money in their pocket, it is rather that of the effects of the pandemic, then the government shouldn't be cutting back spending anymore. Government spending has already fallen quite dramatically in the last 2 years from the phase out of all of those special COVID programs that were in effect. And the federal deficit, which was huge 2 years ago, has almost disappeared. They're almost balancing their budget this year. So we don't need any big restraint on spending from the government. I'd like to see some targeted measures to help Canadians with inflation. For example, there's this Canada housing benefit for renters, for low-income renters. Rents are going through the roof right now. In fact, partly because of the higher interest rates that we've had from the Bank of Canada. Another thing the government needs to look at in this budget is employment insurance. We've got a whole set of reforms that are supposed to be coming through to improve our employment insurance system. That hasn't happened yet. And if we've got a recession around the corner because of interest rates, we're not ready for it with our existing EI system. We've got to fix that up very quickly as well.
Jim, you and I suspect we'll be speaking in a few weeks' time, but for now, thank you for this. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
That is Jim Stanford.